Hello and welcome to our Positive Health webinar series. And thank you so much for joining today, where we will be exploring how to cope with loss and grief during the menopause journey. Many of us experience physical changes and life events that often trigger feelings of loss and grief, especially during the menopause time. And this webinar will point out how we can recognize the symptoms of grief and use various techniques to cope and move forward and thrive. My name is Kim Fancher, and I will be your host today. We here at Positive Health are so honored to be able to bring experts in to share some really great information on menopause topics like this one that are important to you. So now I'd like to get us kicked off. I am so very happy to introduce Denise Shields as our presenter on this topic of grief and menopause. Denise holds a PhD in leadership and is both an ICF certified coach and an International Mindfulness Teacher Association certified teacher, and she is trained as a grief coach. Thank you so much, Denise, for being part of our Positive Health webinar series. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you, Kim. I'm delighted
Awesome.
to be here today.
Well, I think we'd all like to hear from you about your career and how you got into the space, and if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Welcome, everyone. So let me just start by sharing that I've been in the health and wellness arena in leadership roles for the last 15 plus years, leading health and well-being coaching programs. I was with Humana Wellness for many years, and then more recently overseeing the mindfulness training for eMindful, which was a mindfulness training organization. And so my focus on health and well-being really has been a part of my life since early adulthood, but more recently focusing my profession on it. So why grief? Well, I've experienced a good part of life. Grateful to say that I've lived through several decades, and as part of that, I've experienced loss, as I'm sure all of you have as well. And so, loss of opportunities, some of the changes that come with aging and menopause, having gone through that. And then also loss of loved ones, family members, pets, and so forth. And so grief is an area that is near and dear to my heart. I know it's a universal experience, and there's so much that can be gained from applying what we know from mindfulness and self-care to support women through this time. So that is what brought me here. And so today we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about exactly what grief is. And then we'll touch on what are the symptoms? How do you know if you're experiencing grief? We'll then shift to looking at what are the ways that we can move through grief? How do we honor and care for ourselves, our emotions, so that we're able to work through this transition, this experience, and be able to move forward with our lives? And then at the end of our session today, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have. And then along with this, I'll also bring in an experience, a practice where you can get some firsthand experience on the strategy that can help you when you are in the midst of grief and, really, really wanting to care for yourself so that you can move forward. So let's look at what is grief. Well, grief is an experience. It's suffering. It's that experience that we have when something that we care about has been taken away. And so this can be external, it can be an event. So for example, the recent election, I'm sure there are many of you that may be experiencing some grief along with that. If your candidate of choice was not chosen. But it also includes, as I mentioned in my intro, any change. Whenever there's a significant life change, something that we hold dear, something that we care about, is taken away. And it's usually not by choice, right? It's some external factor, some part of our daily lives that has changed. And most importantly, this is a universal human experience. Everyone experiences grief to some extent. Um, we'll see when we look at the emotions, the typical emotion is sadness, and sadness is what we experience when we lose something that we care about. So, Heraclitus, I think, a Greek philosopher, says this really well. There's nothing permanent except change. And we can see this when we look at nature around us, right? The seasons all the time are changing. We have the seasons in our own lives, and we can see that we're changing as we're aging and maturing and growing older, and as we go through the menopause journey. And even when we look at our organizations, our family units, we can see that things are always changing. The challenge that we often have is that we don't want things to change. We like the way they are. Um, and we're, people just in general are comfortable when things are known, right? And there's not uncertainty. But that's not what our lives are. Our lives are full of uncertainty and change. And so the more that we can come to accept this and learn how to navigate the change and the emotions and grief associated with it, the more content we'll be in the long run. So here's a list of significant life changes. And as you look at this list, I would really love for you just to take a moment and just make a mental note. Which are the changes that you've experienced throughout your life and maybe that you're experiencing right now as you're in this journey of menopause? Loss of health is a big one. And it may not even be, when we think about loss of health, it can just be changes. It can be, less flexibility. Maybe those knees or those hips are getting painful when used to be able to run or walk and now you have to slow things down. Or it can be loss of health of loved ones. The change or loss of job is a big one for lots of folks, right? And sometimes it's not even, a change of job. It can just be a change within the organization. There's so much change that takes place that if you're in the corporate world, you're finding that, things are always changing and we're constantly adjusting to what might be changing around us. So I won't go through all of these, but clearly you see that there's also um, changes related to loved ones, right? Relationships break up, friendships fall apart, marriages. We lose loved ones through illness and death, including pets. So these kinds of changes are significant, and these are all triggers that can result in the experience of grief. When we think about menopause specifically, you are probably aware that your body is changing and you're maybe experiencing symptoms that are different than what you experienced before. Maybe there's weight gain that is difficult for you to be able to work through. Maybe there's brain fog, or maybe you're having trouble sleeping. These are all changes that can occur, and for many do occur during the menopause journey. This is not a complete list, but just a start to kind of help you like hone in and recognize that, yeah, when I reflect on my life and even the last few years, perhaps you've likely been touched by change in many different areas. So there are a number of myths and facts about grief that I'd like to touch on because these are common beliefs that folks have, and often we're not even aware that we have these beliefs about how we should work through or deal with grief when we experience it. So the first one is that if you ignore it, it'll go away faster. And this is absolutely not true. So, um, pain, the pain of grief comes from the emotions that are underlying it, which is often sadness or could be anger, could be fear, but the emotions are there. And when we try to push them down, it doesn't go away. It just takes that much longer for us to be able to move through it and heal when necessary. Another common myth, and one that many of us grew up with, myself included, is that it's important for us to be strong in the face of loss. Somehow we believe that we need to be stoic and model that I can handle this loss, this difficulty. And that really is not true. We're human beings and we have emotions. And the emotions come about to let us know that there is something that we need to pay attention to. It's normal to have these reactions, sadness, fear, being lonely, and tears, crying does not mean that we're weak. That's a natural response. And so as we come to embrace a different way of thinking, it's recognizing that, when we are authentic and we take the time to not only allow our own feelings, but show these to loved ones and, friends, family, it's that authenticity helps others recognize that they can be human too. So putting on the brave front is not a healthy way for us to deal with grief. So some common symptoms of grief, and there are several of these that we'll touch on. We'll spend a little bit more time on the emotions, but starting with shock and disbelief. This is very common when we have a sudden loss, and this can be, something that happens within an organization, a job change, maybe you get a new leader. I can't believe this is happening. Your department is shut down, or whatever the case. It also is very common when we lose a loved one. And so, for those of you who may be experiencing this or have, know that this period of just, it's almost like it will feel surreal that this has happened, and that's a natural state. Sadness is the most common, it's universal. And this can be include feelings of emptiness, despair, deep loneliness. Depending on what the loss is, it can result in a lot of tears and emotional instability as well. Very common. Sometimes when we're grieving, we may feel guilt, and this typically is an experience that we have when we lose a loved one. So guilty about, I wish I had time to have said that, or I wish I would have, understood more, or could have one more day. Very, very common, especially if you lose someone who maybe had a long or difficult illness that might result in feeling some relief. And then anger is another one, another emotion that's very common when we experience a change that we don't want. So whether it is the loss of health or a loved one or a change in your work environment, a friend moves away, feeling resentful, angry, why me? It's not right, is very common. So these are common symptoms, and I want to point out that these are universal and they're normal. There's nothing that's wrong about any of these emotions. And then the last one, the emotion that we'll touch on is fear. So sometimes when there's a loss, and I'll use the example right now of our political um, landscape. For many people, there's insecurity right now, worries and fears. We don't know. And it's much the same when, our health starts to change, and maybe you get a diagnosis and you don't know what is this going to mean? Am I still going to be able to do the things that I love? Um, and so fear is a very, very common emotion that's associated with grief. And then, of course, there are all the physical symptoms. And this is how we often know that we're experiencing grief. You might notice that you're feeling fatigued, your energy level just is not there. Maybe there's nausea, or you just keep getting a cold, or just not feeling 100%. For some folks, there can be change in weight, a change in appetite, and insomnia is a big one. Um, I know for myself and my experience with grief, that's one of the first signals for me is to recognize that, oh, there's something that you've lost here. You wake up in the middle of the night and can't fall back asleep because the mind is just racing, thinking through. So know that these are all normal symptoms of grief. And during the menopause journey, they're all very common. So everybody grieves a little bit differently. So even though the emotions are universal and they're all normal, when we go through menopause, in particular, but really with any loss, it's different for everyone. So there's not a certain way that it should be or will be. And so just recognize that your experience of grief and what you're experiencing day to day may not be just like your closest friends or your moms or anyone else that you know personally. And that's okay because we're all unique individuals, and how we grieve is related to a whole bunch of factors, including our personality, life experiences, the social context that, the group that you're in, and as well as cultural practices and so forth. And then, of course, the magnitude of the loss and how much you perhaps value what has been lost. You care about what that loss is. So it's a unique process, and one that we need to pay attention to so that we can best care for ourselves. So there's two um, buckets that I like to think of focus when we're experiencing grief. One of them is to get support, and we'll look at how we go about doing that. And then the second one is to take care of ourselves. And there are a number of different strategies that we can employ that help us care for ourselves during times of grief. So getting support can be as natural as turning to your friends and your family members, those that are there, that love you, care for you, and can lend a listening ear and help validate what it is that you're experiencing. Many draw comfort from their faith, and so your community of faith can be very helpful to get that kind of support. And then there are support groups all over. And I know with Positive Health, not a support group, there is a community, a group that you can get some support through. And in terms of understanding what others are experiencing, and it helps us to normalize and really validate what our experience is. And then finally, talking to a therapist or a grief counselor um, when when you may find that the loss is having an impact on you, where you're experiencing that emotional instability and symptoms that are really hindering your ability to live your life fully, then there's always that option as well, which can be very, very helpful. And now, switching to taking care of yourself. There's so many strategies on self-care. And what we're going to focus on primarily in this next section is tuning into your feelings and your emotions, because this is a way that we can begin to see and allow and nurture ourselves to be able to work through the grief. And then also looking after your physical health, the things that we need to do to care for the physical body. So, tuning into your feelings. So, emotions are one of those things, one of those areas that, as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about how we feel like the myth of how we should show up when we're grieving, taps into that whole way about how we were conditioned or brought up to be aware of our emotions and actually experiencing them. So noticing what we're feeling and being able to name it is a really important step in being able to tune in and to move through the actual emotions of sadness or anger. And then secondly, acknowledging that the pain is here, that this is here, and there's some things that I can do to work through this. Expressing your feelings in either directly through language or in a creative way, such as writing, journaling, poetry, singing, dance. All of those outlets can be very helpful for actually working through the grief and allowing it to to move through you so that you can move forward. So lots of potential ways there. And then being kind to yourself. And that'll be part of the practice that we'll do in just a few moments. So let's talk about recognizing emotions. So emotions are our mind body's way of communicating to to us that there's something here that we have lost, and it needs to be acknowledged, and we need to experience what that loss is. And so the emotion of sadness, for example, which is a very common one, is often felt in the body, as are other emotions, as we start to learn how to be mindful of them. But with sadness, we may begin to notice it based on a heaviness. Well, so a heaviness in the chest, the heart area. Maybe the shoulders are slumping, and we notice that kind of feeling of being weighed down. There might be tears. You might find that you're more sensitive to things around you, events that is just kind of that signal that, oh, there's something here. There's an emotion here that I need to bring some attention to. So when we name our emotions, as I mentioned, that helps us to move through them. There's a saying that I learned back during my study of emotional intelligence that it's kind of a catchy little phrase, name them to tame them. So when we can be aware of the emotion that we're feeling and actually name it, this is sadness, or oh, this is disappointment, or this is anger. Just by saying it, either to ourselves or out loud, is extremely helpful in terms of working through that emotion. Because when we don't when we don't recognize them and we just think, we'll just put that aside, I don't want to deal with that, it doesn't go away. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this. It comes back again and again and again, either in emotional reactions, additional losses, additional life changes that just seem to be piling up, and it just seems like it's more and more, or in many cases in our physical health. When we don't let those emotions move through us, the energy move through us, it gets locked in, and the body does not run at its optimum when there are those energy blocks. So naming the emotion is a very helpful first step to becoming more aware of and actually allowing your emotions to be. And then writing, journaling about your feelings, about your experience is another very, very helpful way to begin to shed some light on what's actually going on in the body and the mind related to this loss that you might be experiencing. So I'm going to take you through a what I think is just a really lovely practice, a mindfulness and self-compassion practice. And for those of you who may be listening to this while you're driving, please don't do this now. You can do this later when you're seated or lying down or standing at home, however is most comfortable for you. But this is an exercise it's a short exercise based on a larger practice called RAIN, RAIN. And RAIN is a practice, a mindfulness and compassion practice that I learned from Tara Brach and have found it to be very useful when experiencing an emotion that may be difficult, like sadness or anger and fear, perhaps that's related to grief. So let me walk through what the exercise is, and then we'll take a few minutes to actually practice it. So RAIN, which is an acronym, begins with recognize. So recognizing that there's an emotion here and identifying what it is. So this can be as simple as just maybe there's a tear. You find yourself teary. It's like, oh, sadness. Sadness is here. You may not know what it's about, but that's a universal symptom or related to sadness sensation. So recognizing it and actually saying, this is sadness, or this is disappointment, or this is anger, whatever the emotion may be. Then the second step is to allow whatever is here for you to be here. And this is the mindfulness. The heart of mindfulness is seeing what's here and allowing it to be just as it is. It is your experience and it's your present moment experience. So allowing it, which just means, giving permission for however you're feeling to be here, not trying to push it away, censor it, question whether it's right or wrong, should or shouldn't, just allowing it. And then the third step is to inquire a bit. So being curious about what's here, what else is here. Maybe noticing the thoughts, the story that you're telling about the loss, about your disappointment or your regrets, or just noticing that, oh, yeah, it helps us to understand where this emotion is coming from. There may be also other sensations that are present or other emotions. So taking a minute just to inquire and see what else is present for you during the experience. And then finally, nurture. That's the N. So taking those few minutes to bring some kind words to yourself and perhaps some compassionate touch that can help to soothe oneself during periods of difficulty. So that's the rain practice. So let's go ahead and try out this practice. So to start with, I'm going to suggest that you take a posture that will support you being both alert but relaxed. So sitting tall, allow the shoulders to drop, feeling the feet on the floor, and dropping your gaze, or if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes. And noticing that you're breathing. So just observing the breath moving through the body. And you might bring attention to where you notice the breath most readily, perhaps in the chest or the abdomen. Just noticing the body breathing. And now I'll ask you to bring to mind a change that you're experiencing now or maybe have recently, perhaps related to your menopause journey, if you will. So noticing what's a change that you're experiencing. Is it, having difficulty sleeping, or maybe you're experiencing brain fog and you're just not feeling as sharp as you are used to feeling, and or maybe you're not able to do the same things you could physically a few years ago. Um, Maybe it's being aware that your childbearing years are past and your children are growing up, and you may be aware of that loss of identity or purpose, all very common losses that we may experience during menopause. So just taking a moment and bringing this to mind. And just allowing this to be as full as it wants to be right now. Focusing on this change, what this means for you personally. And so now, seeing if you can bring awareness to any sensations in the body and beginning to recognize any emotions that might be present here. Is there a sense of tension, like maybe not wanting this, or resistance, which could be anger, um, or perhaps there is that awareness of some heaviness, or some tears, or some softness, some tenderness that signals sadness. And see if you can name this for yourself. Anger is here, or this is sadness. Just simply naming it. And now seeing if you can allow this, just for this moment, allow this to be here as it is. So breathing, noticing that you're breathing, and just allowing this emotion, this experience of sadness or disappointment, or whatever might be here, just allowing this to be here. And now let's take a moment and inquire about what else is going on here. So bringing your awareness to, are there thoughts that you're experiencing right now? What is the narrative that you hear as you are allowing this emotion? And not judging it, just noticing, observing what's here. And you might notice if there are other emotions or other sensations in the body that are present. Maybe there's tightness or a feeling of relaxation or relief that has presented. So just noticing and being curious about what's here. And now we'll move to the nurture part of rain. So bringing some kind words to yourself. And it might be words like, this is hard, or I'm sorry that you're experiencing this. Talking to yourself as you would to a loved one, or someone that you care for deeply who may be experiencing some suffering, some grief around whatever change there is or ever loss. And as you do this, and you can just play with words that feel comfortable for you, it might feel really awkward if you've never um, played with this before. And I encourage you to play with this. It's really a very powerful way to, when we nurture ourselves and are kind to ourselves, to be able to soothe and then move beyond that. And you can bring in, if you're comfortable, some compassionate touch as well. So this might be placing your hands in the heart space and just noticing how soothing that might be for you, or placing your chin in your hands is another way. Perhaps giving yourself a hug, or placing your hands on your head. So just experiment with different ways that you can offer some compassionate touch along with those kind words that acknowledge that this is hard right now and it's okay. You're here for yourself, and it's okay to experience this and allow it so that you're able to move forward with whatever's next. And so as we close this practice, go ahead and take an intentional breath. So breathing in deeply and exhale. You can open the eyes, returning back to this space, and just noticing any shift you might have experienced through that brief mindfulness and self-compassion exercise. The practice of rain, again, just a very lovely strategy that you can bring in at any time. And you don't have to do all of it. Sometimes just naming, recognizing an emotion is a great start. Or sometimes recognizing it and just bringing some compassion. We don't always have the time to, go through the whole rain practice, but it can be very helpful when we can take a few moments just to care for ourselves in this way. And then next, we'll touch on looking after your physical health. And again, these are the basics of health and well-being. Getting enough sleep. As mentioned earlier, sometimes it's hard when we're experiencing grief and loss. Then the mind can often be overactive. And so taking extra care, building in more space in your schedule if you can, so that you have some downtime to relax and care for oneself. Bedtime routines, bringing in that time in advance of sleep time where you're not on social media or taking in, information or any media at all, but or just winding down. so that you're preparing yourself for sleep and just being rigorous about building in the time for yourself to get that needed sleep can be so helpful. Of course, being mindful around your nutrition and as best you can, selecting what you consume so that it's something that'll nourish you and will help your body and your mind heal, work through the grief, so that you'll be, you can be resilient over time and move back to what's most important for you. And then, of course, regular physical activity. So important for keeping the body moving, not taking up a new activity, but bringing in something that used to enjoy or maybe have put on hold. Walking is a wonderful physical activity when you can do that. Um, just to keep the body moving and to have some space to be able to bring attention to how you might be feeling. So all important in terms of supporting yourself during grief. So this now is the time where we'll transition to any questions that you may have right now regarding the information that I shared, or your own experience of grief, what might feel normal or not, or so. I'll pass it over to you, Kim. I think you have some questions from the chat.
I do. And but first off, Denise, I'd just like to mention I really like that rain practice because, if I'm feeling negative thoughts, whether it's grief or something else, I really like that practice to help me turn around those negative thoughts and, improve how I am feeling that day, especially with some of the physical symptoms like, tense muscles and headaches that can occur.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's not about trying to change the thoughts or change how we're feeling, but just the beauty of seeing it, right? Observing it and allowing it is the magic that helps us be able to work through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have any ways to get out of a loop of grief, manifested as anger?
Hmm. Yeah. So it all goes back to the focus on the emotion, right? And so anger is one of those emotions that sometimes we tend to feel wrong about it, like I shouldn't be angry. And especially for women, anger has not really ever been in our culture, has not been an emotion that has been embraced, that has been supported. Um, and so recognizing, first of all, that anger is a normal reaction to having something taken away from us that we care about. So it is something that we care about, which, could be our health, could be our daily well-being, could be our related to our work. Changes happen that we don't want. And so when something is taken away, that it's a normal reaction. So first of all, just validating that, yeah, anger is a natural response. That is the first and the most important step is recognizing that. And then what we do with it is really very, very key. So when we think about mindfulness and where it's really about recognizing it and just noticing the energy in the body and then beginning to, like in the rain practice, inquire, what is this about? When we do that and when we nurture ourselves, then we're actually freed up to think about what is the best course for me to work through this. And it can be all over the place. Sometimes it's just voicing that anger to a loved one and just letting them know and admitting that I am so angry that whatever the story may be. So giving voice to it, journaling is a very, very effective way to communicate anger. Um, of course, there are times where it may be so big, and especially when we're grieving over the loss of a loved one, where it's important to get some support from a counselor or a therapist. So it's not a one size fits all. But clearly, again, the most important thing is to recognize it's normal and allow it and work through it so that you can really get to the place where you can, determine what's the next best thing for me to do with this.
Right. Right. Very good. Do you have anything on any cultural differences when it comes to grief and how it's expressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, with grief, there are a lot of cultures. I'm not going to touch on any specifically, where they are more open in expressing grief, and it's more, more allowed, if you will. And there are many that are probably um, more around holding it in and being more stoic and so forth. So this is important in our social networks and in especially in communities and organizations. It's important for us to recognize like our own beliefs about grief and what's normal, what's not normal, but then also to be respectful of how others might be grieving and to be sensitive to offering support or asking if there's anything that you can do that will support them. But just being sensitive to the differences that might be there in terms of how people look at loss and feel the emotions, and then, of course, grief.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, do you have any, I guess, guidance or recommendations on how do you separate out grief so you don't throw in the towel on things that you actually have some control, which can actually help improve, like exercise more regularly or build some
Mhm.
strength up or stamina or things like that.
Yeah, it does happen often that we can get into a prolonged state of grief, and that often will occur when we're not paying attention to it. Um, because it's uncomfortable and we really don't want to pay attention to it. So, how do we do this? There's no magic wand. And, for many folks, it is very individualized. So, it can be a matter of just taking the time to be with yourself and recognize, ask yourself, what do I need to do to be able to move through this? And again, for many people, journaling is very, very effective. I personally, and in my own experience and in my teaching and coaching, have found mindfulness to be extremely powerful in terms of working through grief, because a mindfulness practice helps you bring attention to what your experience is. And the more that we can do this, the more we can validate and move beyond it. And so I can remember periods of time in my own life where I experienced a loss, and whether it was loss of one of my parents or loss of an opportunity or a change in something that I really cared about, and just having a daily practice of mindfulness where you're just sitting and paying attention to, oh, here's the breath and what's showing up here. How do I need to care for this? It's an amazing antidote, if you will, that I found to be extremely helpful, which is why I focus so much of my my profession on mindfulness because it really can be so helpful to moving through that grief. And connecting with others is extremely important as well. We can't do this alone. Grieving is not meant to be something that we just, hole up and deal with ourselves. So reaching out for the support, connecting with those friends and loved ones and the community that you have here through Positive Health can be just a wonderful way to get support to be able to move through the grief.
Right, right. And you've mentioned several times it's something that you're moving through. And I think many people think of grieving and depression as the same thing, but I believe grieving is more of a process, something that you move through versus depression that it can impact your everyday functioning. Do you have
Yes. Yeah, I
any
like to
thoughts to
think
share on
of
that?
absolutely. I mean, depression is like grief on steroids, right? It's being in that constant state of sadness and not being able to see beyond that. Whereas grief sometimes, we can get into that place where it just seems like it's, not going to end. And sometimes it can, depending on what the loss is, especially with the loss of a loved one, spouse or a child or someone who you hold really dear, um, the support from a therapist or counselor can be extremely helpful. So it's not to say that they don't sometimes go hand in hand, but know that the process of grief, the experience of grief, of feeling the emotions of sadness, often when we can bring attention to that and can be, you know, really taking the time to care for it, we can move through that so that it does, we have that resilience to move forward.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Denise, for all this information. Y- y- You know, grief, there's a lot that's there as far as, life events that can trigger grief, but also through the menopause journey, when people are kind of feeling a loss of things that they used to find pleasurable and now maybe they're not, or they have that lower sense of esteem, self-esteem or confidence in them because of all the different changes going on with them. So I feel like all the different tips and practices that you shared here is going to be very helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. And just one comment on the um, I think I didn't really touch on it too much, but just the loss of identity that we often experience, the loss of
Mhm.
purpose and meaning that we experience during menopause can leave us with that feeling of, prolonged grief because what it's calling us to is to pay attention to where are we going to put our energy next? And so unless we can allow that grief of what was and what we had before, we can't make space for what may be next, which could
Right.
be new creative outlets, new, igniting some passion or idea that has been on hold. And so know that even though we can get into that cycle of it may seem like it's never ending, there is something beyond that. And that opens up when we take the time to care for ourselves fully.
Very true. Awesome. Well, Denise, I think we're about ready to wrap up. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. I just wanted to share some information about an upcoming webinar. We here at Positive Health use the power of webinars and podcasts as a way to build awareness on various topics and, similar to what we're talking about here today. And so our next one that we have scheduled this month, November 20th, is with Skylar Grissell, who has been with us every month this year and talking about some mindfulness practices that could help out during your menopause journey. And so this one in particular is about body positivity. So you can enroll in this by going to our positivehealth.com/webinar site to register for this event. And also on that same page, you'll be able to see the archives of all the previous webinars that we've had throughout the year, including this one here that Denise has provided on grief. And then we have our monthly podcast series as well. And I'm so happy to say that this month in November, we had Denise with us as our guest talking about that, feeling grief during the menopause journey. So if you want to hear more from Denise, please feel free to listen into this podcast episode. And it's available at positivehealth.com/podcast or any of these other sites that you might subscribe to, like Amazon, Apple, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And then I'd like to invite you to be a member of our Positive Health program if you're not already. And, we have this program that's free to join. It offers a one-stop digital health experience supporting your body, your mind, your spirit during the menopause journey. And it says here that it's free till December 31st, but we have extended that now to March 31st of 2025. So if you're interested or you know of someone who might be interested, you can enroll by going to our positivehealth.com/membership site. And then lastly, I just want to mention our community. Denise brought this up several times during her presentation that Positive Health has a menopause journey community that people can be a part of. And, whether it's you're sharing your life experiences or hearing from someone else's, or maybe finding a new resource that you didn't know was available, you can be out there and join in with others that may be having some of the same experiences you are. And if you're interested in more information on how to join, you can email us at info@positivehealth.com. All right. Well, Denise, thank you again for all this wonderful information you shared with us today. We really appreciate, your time and your expertise on this topic of grief, and how we can really understand it and know how we can use these special techniques to cope with grief especially during our menopause journey.
Thank you, Kim. It was my pleasure.
All right. Well, have a wonderful day. Thanks, everybody.